Okay, so the theme of this session is going to be, it's sort of a payoff session, accelerating healthcare innovation to address knee injuries and pathology. And so today we have co-leading the session is Snail, and definitely want to acknowledge all of her work organizing the session this weekend and today, as well as the many hats she wears. So thank you very much. Not easy. And then I also wanted to, I'm going to be speaking today a little bit about my experiences working in the clinical and translational space. And John Elias as well, who's a senior scientist at the Cleveland Clinic, will also be presenting his experience. He's got a long history of working together closely with clinicians, again, in clinical and translational research and implementing biomechanical principles into that process. So welcome. So I wanted to start with a sort of clinical workflow presentation to set the stage for how computer modeling and simulation might fit into this workflow. So, here's maybe a potential clinical workflow that our clinical colleagues may see. Patient goes to a hospital for care after suffering an injury. And then I want to focus on this middle column, this clinical evaluation, which is the key sort of aspect of the clinical decision-making process. There's a face-to-face clinical consultation, clinical discussion between the patient and between the caregiver. There's usually some physical examination, say of the knee, and then there's some imaging that could be all the way from an X-ray to MRI. And so those three components are really the key aspects of a clinical episode of care, which then is used to formulate a treatment plan. And we're very lucky that Dr. Kurt Spindler is here as well. So I just saw you walk in, welcome. And so we definitely encourage any comments, corrections, and critiques. So if I move this to the side, there's a critical decision-making juncture where all of these components have a weight, which then leads to some path taken between the clinician and the patient. And the bet we're making here, and then just in that context, the surgeon over there, years of training, years of experience, has a complex mental model about how one might treat this patient. And that may involve their experiences, that may involve their understanding of biomechanics. It'll involve clinical literature, it'll involve the registry, involve registry data, clinical outcomes data, and it'll involve information about that specific patient. And that'll all come together to come to a treatment plan. And the bet we're all making is that some additional information about the physics associated with the behavior of that knee will improve that treatment plan. And I think there's probably two things that we can bet will stay consistent over the next decade. A lot of things might change, but here's two things that might stay consistent. One, a knee is going to be operated by first principles. Like the knee's still going to, conform to Newton's 3 laws. And then second, surgeons are going to be looking for indications, hints about how to treat a specific patient. So the bet is that we can, with simulation-based approaches, augment that decision-making process as a part of this complex mental model that surgeons have. And so I think biomechanics plays a role. For example, in this study out of the Mars cohort in about 1,200 subjects, traumatic injury is an important part of that. So an injury involves loading across the knee. That load is higher than the failure load of the structure that's being loaded. It's going to break. This is a biomechanical event. We need to understand the forces, loads, movements associated with that. So I think there's a role to play in important areas in orthopedics, like treatment for ACL injury. And then if you look at the total knee replacement space, these are data out of the American Joint Replacement Registry. And let's look at these. Let's say there are top 8 reasons for revision of a total knee replacement. 4 of them are biomechanical. The top 2 are mechanical loosening, that is loosening between the bone and the implant. And then the second is instability. Patient feels when they walk, their knee after total knee replacement doesn't feel like their normal knee. Feels too loose, too tight, unstable. They can't get upstairs, can't get downstairs. They can't perform everyday activities. So biomechanics has a role to play. And the purpose of this session is to talk about some of the experiences of folks working closely with clinicians to implement those biomechanical principles into surgical decision, and then talk about how this ecosystem can help. So, I'm the first speaker. So conveniently enough, I'll talk a little bit about some of my work. I've titled this talk, Earning Clinical Trust in Knee Modeling. So this is thoughts from an engineer working at an orthopedic specialty hospital. And I want to acknowledge on the front end that this is a pretty unique environment, and I'll give you some of the back. And so as part of that, I'll talk a little bit about HSS, the institution that I work for. And then I'll talk about computational modeling to aid in clinical decision making. I already talked about that. And the second, we talked about 11 rules for credibility in modeling simulation. So I think it's actually six rules for earning clinical trust in knee modeling. I think they parallel the credibility rules nicely and complement them. And then I want to talk about the role of open knees and ecosystems, and then it'll, I think, hopefully generate some nice discussion. So Hospital for Special Surgery, or was originally known as the Hospital for Relief of the Ruptured and Crippled. That was founded in 1863. It's the oldest orthopedics hospital in the nation. The Civil War was between 1861 and 1865, so this was founded smack dab in the middle of the Civil War. New York was a very sort of tempestuous time at this point. There were riots going on because of draft and sort of the ability for. I'll leave it at that. There was riots going on in the streets of New York, but James A. Knight, he came up from Baltimore, Maryland, and he had this goal of helping folks basically non-surgically at the time with orthopedic problems, but also things like palsies, prolapses from giving birth. So a whole range of sort of presentations that he treated. So HSS today, these numbers are slightly outdated, but over 215 beds, 36 operating rooms. Most importantly, there's about 10,000 total hip and knee replacements done each year at the hospital, about 1,200 ACL reconstructions. So one thing I always hear at the hospital is our volume is our value, but I also think you have to harness that volume to make it valuable. I think this might be an opportunity to do that more. And also it's sort of a hub and spoke model where there's the sort of central location. The hub is in the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and then there's hubs being opened in primarily the tri-state area, also Florida. But importantly, there's affiliations with New York Presbyterian Hospital, which does some of the emergency room surgery, and also Cornell University, both with a medical school that's located in New York City and the schools of engineering, particularly mechanical as well as biomedical, which is in Ithaca, New York, a couple hundred miles away. And so our department is a group of mechanical, biomedical, and materials engineering. And our goal really is to several things. 1, apply the principles of engineering and material science to solve orthopedic problems. 2, to conduct basic and applied research that translates to improved patient care. And then 3, to provide education training for students and trainees pursuing careers in orthopedic surgery and biomedical engineering. So there's definitely a education component, a research component, and an innovation component that we try to follow. And you might ask yourself, this is an orthopedic specialty hospital. Surgeons do a lot of surgery there. Why on earth are a bunch of engineers swimming in a sea of surgeons and doctors and also physiatrists? What are we doing there? And that this was founded about 50 years ago on the vision of Philip Wilson Jr. He's the surgeon in chief. But prior to, after his training, surgical training, he went on a sort of traveling fellowship he was in California, and he met an individual named Vern Inman. He started a lab after World War II, dealing a lot with the traumatic injuries that soldiers face coming home from the war overseas. And he saw this lab. Vernon was an MD, PhD. He saw the collaboration between engineers and doctors at this laboratory. And he said, we have to have this at HSS. And his foresight and vision spawned the biomechanics department, as you know today. And Vern Inman, that name may be familiar because he published in the 60s some of the seminal publications on human movement. So at a retirement dinner for one of our faculty, I had the privilege of sitting next to Dr. Wilson. And I was like, who is this nice old man that I'm sitting next to? And shortly after hello, he was right on, what is the purpose of your research? How does it affect clinical practice? I was like, oh, it's a pretty intense dinner. But it was tremendously insightful because it expressed his vision. And there's a saying that's attributed to him, which he used in grand rounds: stand up, speak up, and shut up. So he really did not suffer fools lightly and got to the point and really needed to understand the connection between what you're doing and how it affected clinical practice. And so that is in the DNA of our department. And that's trickled down through the years. I'll highlight one. This is a close clinical collaboration between Al Burstein, John Inzal, the engineer and the surgeon respectively, which led to the development of the posterior stabilized knee implant. Not to go into too many details of that. But I also wanted to highlight in the context of this meeting that there's roughly a 40-year history of computational modeling in the department. Al Burstein, if you look at this computer, this is an early CAD system. And if you look closely, the brand name is written on it. It's MC Auto. And I was like, is that Macintosh? What is that? So I looked it up. This is actually a CAD platform that was developed by McDonnell Douglas, the airplane manufacturer. And because at the time, the airplane manufacturers developed their own systems for CAD modeling with the tools they needed. And then they thought one approach was to commercialize those tools to be released to the public. I looked at the price. It's somewhere between $20K and $30K in $1980. So that's probably about, roughly factor 10 if you, double this at for 4 cycles, let's say. So this is a pretty expensive system, but this was sitting smack dab in the middle of the biomechanics department at HSS in, the early 80s. But also notice this is a collaboration between an engineer, actually 2 engineers at the time, and David Yasker, who became an MD and now is practicing in Long Island. So again, these research questions that were computational modeling were applied for really were focused on clinically relevant questions. This is a publication from about 40 years ago. It's probably about 20, 40 elements in this. You almost can solve this finite element problem by hand, but the clinical application was, can you use metal backing at the bone implant interface in the tibia to underlie the tibial insert? And so, the key point I want to make is that the first author here is a PhD, the last author is an MD. So again, I wanted to highlight that close clinical engineer interaction. And so personally, I'm approaching 20 years at HSS. I started when I had hair, and now I don't have hair. So I don't think it's causal, but but I wanted to share some of my experiences related to my almost 2 decades of working at the hospital. And so I'm going to skip this part because I already discussed it. Oh, and the theme will be, again, we talked about a lot about credible practices for modeling and simulation. So I wanted, and the 10 sort of key aspects of that. And I wanted to talk about 6 rules for earning clinical trust in knee modeling. Again, acknowledging that we're working very closely with our surgical colleagues. And so going into these rules, rule 1, we definitely aim to foster close clinical collaborations. In other words, our doors are always open. We're there to help. We are open and always willing to listen and understand what your problems are clinically and how we might be able to add engineering insight and value to them. And so I want to talk a little bit about the profile of a typical orthopedic surgeon. One, these individuals are extremely busy and they have very demanding schedules. So we're always very grateful when they make time to see us and talk to us. So we always have a mindset of gratitude, and we're overjoyed that we have this opportunity to work closely with our clinical collaborators to help address clinical problems. Two, they're the experts. They know the the problems they face in the clinic. So this is definitely sort of a customer relationship sort of mindset. We're there to listen much more than to talk. We want to understand where they're coming from, where their problem is, and then we can work together to generate a question and a hypothesis, in terms of modeling a context of use. And then 3 and 4, surgeons typically have, the typical saying, you ask 10 surgeons for their opinion, you get 300 ideas. So they have many ideas, but will likely not know the resources that are required to do them. And they're very results and progress oriented. So it's very important on our end to be able to set expectations for the resources in terms of time, cost, personnel. And so this interaction, transparent expectation setting, but really listening to what problem they're trying to address and how we might be able to help is very important for us. And then finally, most surgeons, some are, but most are typically not engineers. So we want to limit the engineering jargon, even at the expense. I know we're typically, as engineers, we're very sort of detail oriented, but we sort of limit the engineering jargon. But we know that the surgeons are going to learn as the projects progress. And that is one of our things that make me smile when surgeons know the difference between stress and strain and how that might lead to a failure criteria and why one might be more important than the other. And then they can explain that to their clinical colleagues from the podium at a conference, for example. So rule 3, we want to build strong teams. And this first concept about this pyramid of building a strong team, this is from Patrick Lencioni, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. We definitely try to provide a safe environment to speak up. And that most of the time that means not being judgmental, just listening. Second is we want to confront problems quickly and directly. We don't sweep problems under the rug. And that could mean clinical problems, issues with resources, et cetera, time, its cost, et cetera. We address those transparently and directly. And then we want to make sure, if we're going ahead, that we have clear directions and priorities, because only with that type of understanding can we have an assured mutual commitment to the project. There has to be some definition of those priorities. And then with those priorities stated, we can address accountability. All team members are accountable for their roles in the project. And then typically that leads to a motivated and engaged team. So that would be rule 3. And then rule 4 is we show up for the surgeons. We come to the surgeons by virtue of their busy schedules, they usually meet earlier or later. We're there. And we're in the room with them and we're listening to them and we're trying to understand how a modeling and a simulation approach, for example, may help their clinical decision-making process. By the way, these are 3 surgeons on staff: senior surgeon, Andy Pearl, a mid-level surgeon, Daniel Nawabi, and then a junior attending surgeon, Mark Amurtharaj. And you can see that bald, shiny dome on the bottom right, as well as the engineer whose back is to us, unfortunately, Isabella Gomez. She's the engineer driving this project. So rule 5 is understanding clinical context of use, research questions, and hypotheses. So we want to be very clear about the context of use because that helps understand what we need to measure, the signal, so to speak, the difference in 2 outcomes, that is the difference in an outcome before and after a treatment that is clinically relevant. And that helps us put in the context of the ability of a measurement instrument. You can think of a model as a measurement instrument, the noise in that measurement instrument, and then if the signal to noise ratio is adequate for answering that specific question. So we definitely have gone more towards I guess it's more of a top-down approach where we have an outcome, a model, a computational model can give us mechanical estimates of a given quantity, and we need to apply that to clinical data. And then the next step is understanding, for example, males, females, injured, uninjured soccer players, let's say. And we want to see if any measurements from this model differentiate or categorize or classify these subjects. And then the nice thing is, if they do, then you have the opportunity to go bottom up and understand mechanistically what might be driving that difference because of the mechanical principles that our models are governed by. And so, again, if this is an example of a video that really got our surgeons' attention. Notice it's not quantitative, it's purely qualitative. And this is in response to a compressive and a valgus and an anterior force, a sort of clinical pivot shift simulation. And you can see that one knee, this injured female on the right, the red arrow, again, I'm sorry, tibia's up is anterior, and then to the right of each is the medial side of the knee. And the arrows in the middle represent the estimated force in the ACL. But you can see these stark differences in loading of the ACL and the associated kinematics with these two classifications. And so I remember showing this to Dr. Pearl, and he kept replaying it over and over and over because he was just so dumbfounded that, again, if you go from the bottom up, structure now matters in these cohorts. And that may drive differences in loading of the ACL. So, final rule, keep it as simple as possible, but not too simple. So to do that, we really have to understand context of use. Say we want to paint this tree. Something like this might be too complicated. This may be too simple. Something might just right. So we want to be aware of what's too complicated, what's simple, what might be just right. And, over the last 40 years, we have this whole range of tools that have been developed by the modeling and simulation community. And there's an opportunity to pick what level of complexity might be the most appropriate for your problem, for your clinical context of use. And so I'll give two examples very quickly. For example, we're looking at ACL injury. We know that a secondary restraint which becomes in the ACL intact knee, which becomes a primary restraint to anterior applied loads in the ACL deficient knee. But we're going to imagine this here we go. So we know that medial meniscus is a secondary restraint, so which becomes a primary restraint when the ACL is absent. And so we might, again, in terms of context of use, we can help to start to inform, does our model need a medial meniscus? How do we represent the slacks in these various tissues? How do we represent the medial meniscus? My point by saying this is that the context of use helps dictate how we might approach the modeling. And let's talk about knee instability following ACL injury again. Let's talk about the pivot shift exam, a complex multiplanar set of loads where the surgeon feels a sudden rapid reduction or subluxation of the tibia relative to the femur as the knee is flexed or extended. And the point here is we may need to understand some complex restraints to knee rotation. We may be able to need to better understand how the anterolateral capsule and the ITB are modeled. So there's this complex interaction of context of use, how simple and how complicated you might make the model, and how you might then use that to answer your research question. So again, we have our anatomy here. But I do notice that in the modeling and simulation community, there is sort of an approach that you need the cruciates and you need the menisci, and maybe that's enough. And it is, and it may be enough, but it really depends on the context of use, and you want to be able to consider the anatomy and the complexity of the anatomy in the context of that. So to summarize, our 6 rules for earning clinical trust in knee modeling: 1, foster close clinical collaborations; 2, understand your clinical collaborator; build strong teams; number 3. Number 4, show up. Number 5, understand that clinical context. And then 6, be as simple as possible, but not too simple. So in terms of the role of open knees as an ecosystem, I just provided some topics for potential discussion later. 1, we could, again, be a source of this anatomical knowledge for engineers. You can imagine, as a grad student in a university, in a mechanical engineering department, your advisor says, go build a knee model. You have thousands of anatomical publications to look for, even describing the knee. That could be daunting. We have the opportunity to provide curated data, both on the biomechanical, the imaging, and the clinical side. And as Ahmet in discussions with me noted, being a marketplace to connect PIs with engineering experts. Ahmet also noted providing certification, a model, again, that modeling checklist that we discussed yesterday. And then again, tools for increasing model throughput. There's an implementation gap that we're addressing now as a community, and which is going to help us springboard into this clinical realm. And then I think ultimately you're going to have to prove that these models can affect in a positive way clinical workflow, clinical decision-making process. So that may ultimately require a clinical trial. And so there's an opportunity there as well. But thanks very much.